welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Turn the Page. I'm your host today, Jen, and today I am joined by two researchers, two authors who have been to the show before to talk about an absolutely phenomenal book called The Bright Ages, I think 2 years ago, perhaps, and they are back today to talk about another fantastic book. So without further ado, welcome. Could I ask you to introduce yourselves and your book, please?
I'm David Perry. I'm the undergraduate advisor for history at the University of Minnesota. I'm a full professor and I have a history PhD and a journalist, and I like to write books with Matt.
I'm Matthew Gabriele. I'm a professor of medieval studies at Virginia Tech, and most of the time I also like to write books with Dave.
I'll take it. I'll take it.
Excellent. Welcome back. And you are here to discuss today Oathbreakers, the War of Brothers that shattered an empire and made medieval Europe. Last time you were here to talk about The Bright Ages, which was an absolutely phenomenal book. And it was a delight to read, and it was a delight to see the response to that book and sort of its reception and just the sort of general, not even just positive comments that it engendered, but like a lot of joy, I think, just for like the medieval and for history. Like it was just a kind of really nice thing to see. Yeah, could you talk a little bit about like what it was like, what the reception was like for you to that book?
You write a book that makes a big argument, you put it out in the world, people react. And I would say it was overwhelmingly positive. And even people who disagreed with this thing or that liked the general, in general, people, like the argument. And I do feel like as time has gone on, it now sort of sits in the culture as something that when people say things like the Dark Ages or make, general comments about the Middle Ages, it shows up as an answer. So, there's a lot of people right now, not to be political, but there's a lot of people right now on social media who are talking about RFK Jr., the nominee for HHS, and saying he wants to take us back to the Middle Ages, which he does not. And whatever you think of him, that is not true. And people are responding with our book. Or I just got a book from Johns Hopkins. I haven't read it yet, but called Averting the Digital Dark Age. And I picked it up at a book exhibit, and I was really like, oh God, what are they going to say? And on page 3, they say, so historians Matthew Gabriele and David Perry say, and I don't know what the answer is going to be. Like, I need to sit down with it and seriously read it. It's about, data rot in the 21st century. But when they use this word dark age, right, they at least like had something to read to think about it. And I mean, I don't know. I mean, so like that's great. That's really great. That it's in these conversations, and hopefully will stay there going forward.
Yeah, and it pops up in really weird and interesting places. David and I just recently got invited to talk to a class, at a classroom in Texas. I mean, that's always really exciting. Even, we're 3 years out, more than 3 years out from the book's release. I got an email from an early music person who's doing an online harp course, and she was wondering if I might come in and just talk about the Middle Ages generally, because she read The Bright Ages and loved it and is recommending it to all her students. So, I mean, those kinds of moments I think are the most exciting for the type of writing that we're doing, both for Bright Ages and our new book, which we'll talk about, of course, in a minute, is just like the random people who are able to see it and then share it with others. And that's primarily kind of what we were trying to do, I think, with the Bright Ages initially, is just not to say that the Bright Ages were great, and I think people misread sometimes the title in that way, but rather that it is a noble period and that there's an excitement to learning about the past and how things were different and showing how things didn't have to turn out the way that they did, and that there were all these alternatives, and this is how historians understand those possibilities of the past.
Mhm. I'm really glad you brought that point up because it leads to one of my questions I've been most excited to ask, which is, you spend a lot of time in your new book, Oathbreakers, also talking about not just history, but the ways in which historians create history from sources that are both extremely fragmented and extremely biased in terms of authorships and what they're trying to do. That is expected in academic history, that you're going to engage with like how you are writing history and stuff like that. Do you have to change your approach when you are demonstrating that to a popular audience, or does it feel like you are doing sort of the same thing?
No, it's really interesting. So David and I were just recently, I guess a few weeks ago, in New York City at the biggest conference for historians, the American Historical Association, which was meeting in New York. And we were on a panel about kind of writing more popular facing histories. And on that panel was a colleague, one of David's friends, Ada Palmer, who's also a science fiction author, a well-known science fiction, award-winning science fiction author. And she is coming out with a book about kind of, which she calls, we didn't call it that, but we love it, kind of the sequel to the Bright Ages, and it's called Inventing the Renaissance. And so it's kind of doing for these misconceptions about the period for the Renaissance what we tried to do for the Bright Ages. And one of the things that she said during her presentation was, talking about the way that history is made, which historians call, and how historians have thought about the past in the past, is what we call historiography. And she said, like, popular audiences actually love that stuff. And that's the thing that we found, is that we are really interested in these questions of not just kind of what do we know, but how do we know? And so we tried to convey in Oathbreakers, we have plentiful sources about this early medieval period, this period of the late 8th and early 9th century. We have lots of sources, but the sources are trying to tell us something that we're not asking. There's a story that they themselves want to convey to future generations, and how do we move through that? And how have other historians kind of moved through that? And people are really curious about that, because they think that sometimes they think, I should say, popular audiences, sometimes they think that history is just kind of this thing that you can go into the past, you fish it out of the lake and you put it there, and that's what it is. But the process of how we know something about the past is really interesting to a lot of people. And this gave us a really great opportunity to do that.
I do think there is, in our case, a productive tension with wanting to do this, but also trying to write for a broad
Yeah.
audience. And fortunately, we have a really good relationship with our editor, Sarah Haugen at HarperCollins, but she is not a medievalist. She's a general, serious trade nonfiction editor, right? So she, like, I am guessing that most of the things she knows about the 9th century came from working with us on our book. Like, that was not something she might, know more about. She definitely knows more about it now. She might want to keep learning about it, but she didn't start with pre-existing knowledge. So she challenges us and productively. And, if our reflex is just to stick some historiography in a paragraph, which it is at least the reflex I was trained in, her reflex is to say, does this really have to be here? But if the answer is yes, then the answer is yes. And if it works, then the narrative, it works. And so it's, this is part of the writing process, is to understand your audience, and hopefully to have professional support with different frameworks. I'm not going to mention any other books, but there are books out there that are history books, popular history books, that just reiterate content from especially translated primary sources in exciting, dramatic ways, but as if we could just read those sources naively and as true, because they're great stories. And I mean, I have real criticism of lots of academic historical writing, but I also have a real criticism of that strain of popular historical writing too, that just takes a source and says, this is what it says. Again, I'm not going to mention any names, but it's out there, and Matt and I are trying to balance between, I think, trying to find the right balance.
Yeah, I was going to say, I don't want to be a jerk, but like there's some academic
Yeah,
scholarly writing that does that too. So yeah.
100%.
Yeah.
I mean, we became historians because we love reading sources and thinking really hard about what they do. And as Matt says, like, people love it. People love historiography if you present it in the right or a right way. If you present it in a way that it becomes accessible, people love that stuff.
Absolutely. So I'm curious about your pivot from the Bright Ages to this project. So it is narrower in scope, which is, not to say that you still couldn't write like several dissertations and books and classes about this topic. But what was the prompt to write something that was a little bit more on a smaller geographical and time frame? Like, what was the inception for wanting to deal with the Carolingians?
Yeah, I think so. So after Bright Ages was published, and you're absolutely right. So most times, I think when people who write public-facing or more popular histories, they tend to go from the narrow to the big. And we kind of did the opposite, as we started off with this kind of bigger history of the European Middle Ages, covering about 1,000 years and more across kind of 3, maybe 4 continents, blah, blah, blah. And then we're dealing really with kind of 3 or 4 years that we're really kind of focusing on, maybe kind of a decade or two or something like that. And then very kind of historically located within kind of Central and Western Europe. Um, and really the process was a little bit of trial and error. Is that I think when David and I kind of finally recovered from having written the Bright Ages and kind of doing publicity, and we started to think about different projects, we had like, I don't know, 4 or 5 different kind of ideas that we tossed around between us, some of which we brought to our agent just to kind of run by him, some of which never even made it that far. And our agent was very polite, and this is one of the reasons that we have the same agent. One of the reasons that we like him is that he was very clear, like that our idea sucked. Um, but again, like nicer, but very clear, like, yeah, that ain't gonna work. And so we were kind of, casting about, and the Carolingian idea was something that I'd had kind of a long time ago about like this would be like a really cool kind of TV series almost, because it is so dramatic and so there's some sources. And so David and I just kind of, I think David, you actually suggested is like, why don't we just do this? Why don't we try it? And we wrote up just a little bit of a thing. Our agent like said, like, let's talk as soon as possible. And he was like, yeah, this is it. This is the project. So we came up with a proposal and we kind of sent it off. But I think the thing that it attracted us to it generally, or made us excited about it when we were thinking about it, and then when we started writing, is the number of actual primary sources from the period that we have, and how absolutely dramatic the scenes are within this story of a fratricidal civil war of an empire breaking down, because it really is, it's brothers fighting against brothers, it's people being accused of witchcraft, it's murders, it's blindings, it's betrayals, it's armies abandoning their king on the field of battle, and then at the end, right, like a division of the empire that would ultimately, though not intentionally at the time, lead to or set the stage for kind of some of the more modern divisions of Europe, and all the kind of historical problems with attaching an event in the 9th century to things that happened in the 19th century that kind of happened after that.
I wanted, once we had other big book ideas that again, our agent either said sucked or were certainly not commercially viable, which is part of why you have an agent.
That's a nicer way of saying something.
I like
yeah.
not commercially viable rather than sucked, but I'm not convinced that's true. But I'm going to say it anyway. But also like, so we created the Bright Ages, right? It's 1,000 years and 80,000 words. It's a framework. It has certain kinds of ways of thinking about that period in terms of being very human, in terms of being knowable, in terms of being a connected, permeable world that if you sort of zoom into any one spot, you can see how that spot is connected to other places. You'll see people acting as people with, different frameworks, different ideas, but still fully human, all these sort of frameworks. And I hope to spend, and I felt this at the time too, I would like to spend as much time as possible telling smaller stories that are part of that framework, right? And of course, there is literally an infinite number. Some of them are more dramatic, and we started with this ultimately dramatic one. We don't have another book proposal going forward. I'm not telling people there's a series coming, although if someone would like to send us a 10-book deal, that probably I'd like to take that call. It has not happened, or Hollywood or HBO or whatever. But like I just telling stories about this section of the past in a way that continues our themes in whatever capacity it is. So this story is human. It is connected. There are these key moments where sort of the brothers are really focused inward, and then the outside world comes knocking because they're connected. There's a lot of stories like that that fueled the Bright Ages. Each chapter has some of them, but there's so many more. And this is one that we could see. Some of them might be 10 pages long, but this is one that from kind of the first conversations we could see. This is a book length story, but also it is a book length story. It's not it's not 1,000 pages. We can do it in a single volume and really tell the story you want to tell. So that was fun, and it turned out to be true. Those guesses that summer turned out to be true about what it might look like in the end.
Yeah, it's a great topic for like what you want to do with the book, because you are absolutely correct that there is like a really compelling human narrative there with lots of figures who are, understandable, but just inscrutable enough to keep you really invested in trying to figure
Yeah.
out what they're going to do. But it also gives you all of these opportunities to dig underneath like the narrative that the sources present you with and to look at the, the guts of how history is written both then and now. Um, was there a particular part of the story or a particular historical actor who was a particularly tough nut to crack? What was the hardest sort of, I don't want to use the word popularize really, but like was there a figure or event or source that really challenged your ability to like relate it accessibly, if that makes sense?
Well, I'll start with one. So the most important thing that happens in our book is this battle at Fontenoy on, I should know this date, I've said it a million times. I think it's June 25th, 841. And on a Saturday, a nice Saturday morning. We think the weather was pretty good. And it is the only big battle in some ways. There's lots of fighting. The only big battle where, armies line up on each side and then advance at 8 o'clock in the morning as planned. And then the results are really dramatic, and they're not just dramatic politically and militarily, but dramatic in terms of the reaction to having, Franks kill Franks, brothers kill brothers. There's a whole cultural, emotional reaction that really matters a lot. We really don't have great sources that say what happened militarily during the battle itself. Who maneuvered where, who went up the hill, who went down, who launched flights of arrows, who charged in with their cavalry, who, didn't charge in with their cavalry in time and so got routed. Like, we have descriptions. The best descriptions are really just kind of copy paste adaptations of the Aeneid. So they're really pretty. They're really beautifully written, but they're not reliable military history. So that was a real challenge because we had to tell the story. We cannot write this book without a good story about what has happened at this battle, but the sources made it difficult. And so what we resolved it by writing things like, this is our best guess. And here is how we made this set of guests. Here are the assumptions we've made going in, and here's the story we're telling you. So we said, we're going to tell you our best story, and then we're going to tell you why we made the choices we made to tell you this best story. But acknowledging, like, it is possible that, in fact, Louis did not charge into battle, or Lothar did not charge into battle, but in fact just stood and watched the whole time and thought, maybe I should charge into battle. Oh no, I better run away. I don't really know. I have a guess, but I don't really know.
So yeah, for me, I think I'll answer two ways. Is that one, the most interesting character for me is the character of Lothar, who's Louis the Pious's eldest son. Is kind of set to inherit the empire, and in fact is crowned co-emperor, and then becomes kind of the centerpiece of the civil war, rebellions against his father first during his father's lifetime, and then kind of the centerpiece who his brothers unite against in the civil war of the early 840s. And the reason for that is that because he's often portrayed, we don't have a lot of sources about him specifically. We have some stuff. But most of the sources that we have either are written from the perspective of one of his brothers or his father. So he always kind of comes out the villain in those, understandably, in the way that they tell their stories. And he seemed to be a much more nuanced, interesting character the more that we read about him throughout, and tracking his development, across the 830s and the 840s. He's just a really interesting character. There is a British scholar whose dissertation was on Lothar, and I'm hoping someday she will publish that book, because I will eagerly devour it, but it's not out yet. The most frustrating thing for me was all the women of the Carolingian period, of the 830s and 40s. And the reason I say that is because it is so clear from all of the sources, and we have some very good secondary scholarship. Some modern historians have written about this. They're so important to the running of empire, to everything that's going on. Every decision involves a queen, a sister, a mother, something like that. But the sources just don't want to talk about them. They just don't want to talk about them. So, for example, when Louis the Pious takes over from his father, Charlemagne, in 814, Charlemagne's daughters, Louis's sisters and half-sisters, are all around the palace. It is very clear that they are kind of pulling the strings about what's going on in the empire. One of the first things he does is banish them, and we never hear from them again. But they're really important. Like they're super important, super important for the last few years, and we just don't know a lot about them. Judith, Louis the Pious' second wife, the mother of Charles the Bald, with the youngest son who ends up getting involved in the Civil War as well. Like an incredibly important person, runs the palace in Louis's absence when he's out on campaign. Very deft political maneuvering to get her son involved in succession plans. And all we have is kind of enemies of her characterizing her as a witch and a seductress, who uses devil magic to bed her cousin Bernard of Septimania and cuckold her husband. Like, but there's so much more there that that the sources just don't want to tell us. And I think that throughout has just been incredibly was really frustrating. And we tried as much as possible to include what we could know, but it was just that we just ran up against a wall at certain points.
I mean, Charles was a teenager during the run up to the Civil War, and then 18 when the Civil War starts. And his mom is there. Like we do have sources, and then he reconnected with his mom,
Yep.
right? And there's moments where he's like, and then he talked to his mom, and she said, "Show mercy" or something, which is sort of a trope, but also like it's not hard to imagine an 18-year-old coming out of this bloody battle going to talk to his mom. And like
Yep.
it's very suggestive, but it is only suggestive, and so we suggested. But I hope, maybe some great novelists will pick it up and then write a novel, Judith, and do it. But it would take, it would take a lot of imagination. And I'm for it. But
That would be a hell of a novel.
It'd be a great novel, right? She's totally
so
there.
good.
Yeah. So
I would.
to all those people out there who like historical fiction, go read about Judith and then send me a draft.
Yeah.
I'll share it with my agent.
I'm
Yeah.
holding our audience to that. I need to read that book too. And that is so interesting. As you were talking just then, I was thinking about, how power is often gendered as either hard or soft, and how that then overlays, like, how likely is the power you exert to show up then in the sources about, the time period you lived in. That's really, really interesting.
And when Judith's power does show up in the sources, it's a gendered criticism of it being sort of too present, too effective, and then they gender it by saying it's magic and sex, right? And none of this is surprising to historians, but it is. I mean, it is what they do. It's right there. So,
that brings me into my biggest question, I think, which is that you are telling a story and analyzing history from a time that obviously feels very different from our own, but also sort of in themes and perhaps in human foibles and political maneuvers, also feels pretty relevant and has a lot of currency sometimes, especially as you talk about Civil War and, brother against brother. I feel like these are things that are in the air. There's one really great turn of phrase that you have in the book that felt so relevant, which is that it was a moment of acute political and cultural crisis that sort of accompanies a breakdown of ideological consensus, right? So when you are writing a story about medieval history, but also trying to draw out these connections to what we are living through now, how do you balance like pointing out that relevancy and perhaps the ways that history rhymes with not wanting to write history that is overly teleological and, overly deterministic, if that makes sense?
Yeah. I think the main way that we try to do it, and we did this in the Bright Ages, and we certainly tried to do it, and I think we do it pretty well in Oathbreakers as well, is just to show how decisions are made, at least as far as we can tell, and that people had options. So to make sure that it's clear that things didn't have to work out the way that they did, that there are people who are driven by motivations. Some of those motivations are knowable to us. Many of those motivations are knowable to us, and that things always kind of could have been otherwise. And I think that the past, just kind of generally, I think, and I don't want to speak for David, but I think we're kind of on the same page here, is that I think we both understand that, or we both think, and we both would strongly argue that the past is important for understanding the present. It is one part of an explanation about why we're here, but it is not the only one. And it doesn't justify the fact that we're doing things in a certain way at a certain time. Our epilogue, for example, talks about the small kind of stone monument, this obelisk, on the battlefield at Fontenoy, or at least we think is the battlefield at Fontenoy. And it was erected in the 19th century in the midst of kind of another empire making by Louis Napoleon, the Emperor Louis Napoleon in France. And they wanted a teleological history. They wanted Fontenoy to mean something important to the destiny of empire in the 19th century, to draw a direct line, what David and I have called kind of a rainbow connection between now and the present, right? Where you just kind of skip over all the bad stuff in between two historical moments and you connect those things directly. And then we talk about like how our sources tell us like, no, that's not true. Like we've gone through the entire book. We've shown you like that's not at all what was going on. And yet the 19th century is very consciously rewriting it. And that so we have to be really careful when people deploy the past in that way to justify particular political or cultural concerns in the present.
One of the things about writing history is that you hope it will have a book, right? You hope it'll have a lifespan beyond the moment. And I hope that with both these books, they'll have a lifespan behind the moment. And I think sometimes when you write, when again, sort of in the popular history world, when it's really located in sort of then and now, you limit the duration of your book, and maybe it's good in the moment. So that's something just from a writer perspective, like we want to be thoughtful about. There's no question that for me and for Matt, thinking about a society that believes it's relatively stable and yet falls apart so quickly has a lot of currency in 2020's America. It would be foolish to pretend otherwise, but we didn't feel with Oathbreakers we had to say that exactly. We felt that we could show rather than tell. I actually think telling is fine. I think that there's a lot, I do a lot of very explicit telling in my short form journalism, where I say this is what's happening and this is what you should think, and that is not what we do in longer form history. But we all know that the historians of the 50s were thinking about World War II, and that influences how they, just the European historians, right? That influences how they developed new ideas about the Middle Ages that then directly informed at least our PhD advisors who then taught us, right? It's like the historiography has moments and the historiography, but also like it's really hard to tell how right now is influencing the writing of history right now. That's going to be something where people 30 years from now, people can let us know or longer. So there was a moment in the Bright Ages where we did say, hey, we're writing about the Black Death during a pandemic. Boy, that matters, but but we didn't say, and this is the cause, or to try to we said, look, we're humans, we're writing in a historical moment that influences our writing of history, but not to then say, and this is why history is the way it is. So I think that's what we aim for.
Yeah, and I think I want to emphasize that too. I really absolutely agree with what David was saying. Is like I think there are too many, my mild critique of our profession as historians and people who think about the past is that they pretend again that they could just be objective observers, that they're not located in time and space. And we're not in any way, both in the Bright Ages or in Oathbreakers, trying to pretend that we're not people who are living, 2020, 2025, I guess it is right now. But at the same time, like we want to be as transparent as possible when that matters and when it doesn't. So
That's so interesting. Yeah, because I was mainly thinking about, in the book, you pay a lot of attention to, as you said, contingency and the choices that people do not make, in addition to the ones that they do, because those could be just as important. But you're also paying a lot of attention to contingency in the writing of history, and like when you are writing happens to matter, and who you are, and what's happening in the world and in your personal life. It's all like a lot to be aware of, and I think it's all really handled very gracefully.
oh, thanks.
I have one more question. Okay, this is a little bit of a silly question to wrap on, but I did see that in the lead up to this book's publication, you did a Reddit Ask Me Anything about it, which is something that you have you did before with the first book, I believe, right?
Yep.
Could you talk a little bit about that experience and also why you choose to post as Haimo of Auxerre?
Well, Matt, let me just say, we love Ask Me Anything. We think it's the best, one of the best forums on the internet, period. And it's because it's so well moderated, so that and it has been for, I don't know, a couple decades, I think, certainly a long time.
Yeah.
And with veteran moderators and then a veteran community who knows the expectations and quick response, but response calling people saying, hey, let's shift it this way or that way, to people who join in there. it's just a great community, and historians are lucky that it exists. And I think more historians should know it exists and should, I actually don't spend a ton of time there. Matt's always spent more time there than me, but I'm glad it's there, and
Yeah.
I think the profession needs to be grateful to it for being there and being so well run. So
Yeah.
I'll say that.
Yeah. No, Ask Historians, the Reddit, like if anybody who's listening, like go find the Ask Historians subreddit. Like there are some amazing questions. The best question, and then I'll answer your other question, about why I'm Heimovix there, is did President Garfield ever eat lasagna? And I saw one of the most thoroughly researched, most amazing posts I've had. Like this should be a movie. Like it was amazing. This guy tracked down this historian, this American historian, who knows something about Garfield, tracked down Garfield's itinerary. He visited Italy at one point and and then went through food history to figure out when kind of a lasagna became a popular food item, because there's a long history there. And he figured out, like, we can't actually prove it, but it's possible at these particular moments he may have actually eaten lasagna, which is just like, it's just an amazing question, and it's amazing nuanced response, which demonstrates, like David and like we've been talking about this whole time, is about like how history is done. Like, how do
Yeah.
you figure something like that out? Like, there are sources, and you can look at them, and then you make kind of educated guesses, and you put things together in different ways, and it was just really lovely. So that's not the only reason that I love Ask Historians, but it is one of the many reasons that I love Ask Historians. So David and I both have kind of weird handles, all over the place. In like my social media, I use Prof. Gabriele because I just kind of settled on that, and that's what I use. So Jaime Voxer is nobody knows who that is, and it's really great because nobody can pronounce it or anything like that.
Yeah, I can.
Because it's all kind of one word. He was a 9th century biblical commentator, who I think is just like super interesting. And I had an academic book come out earlier in the year with Oxford University Press, in which I talked a lot about Jaime, because he has very interesting ideas about kind of how sacred time works and how history works. Again, like I'm really interested in kind of how people think about the past, even in the Middle Ages, how they thought about the past. And then what happened basically is that I was creating way back when, like probably, in grad school or something like that, like a PlayStation account, and I didn't want to use my real name. And so I was like, nobody's going to know who Jaime Hoxter is. So I just did that. And then I just kind of used that kind of around. And I did that for Reddit too, because like I didn't want to like necessarily hide who I was, because I'm always on like our university's subreddit, or at least trolling, like looking at your university subreddit. But I didn't want to have my name kind of readily available. So I used that. And I realize I'm kind of giving that away right now, but it's what it is. People can easily figure that out if they
Yeah.
ever wanted to find it out. So yeah, not a lot of Hymo stands out there. Anyway, so
What I want to point out there is that part of the reason I think one of the things I really enjoyed about working on Oathbreakers is that I'm a Venetian historian. I work in the 12th, 13th century as an academic, and Matt has been thinking about the Carolingians in the 9th century for a much longer time, and I think that was good. It was good teamwork in some ways, because I mean, I know the history, but I didn't know the history. But also having someone who has been thinking about something for 30 years is a different level of knowledge, and it was really, fun to see that come out, but in accessible prose. We did not. I don't think Jaimo shows up in the book. I'm sorry, Matt.
he does not, but he's in my heart. So
Yes, I know he is.
That's what
I
it
know
is.
he is.
And let me say too, I mean, I think that's one of the productive tensions that's in our writing partnership too, is that, David and I are both medievalists, and from the outside world, like we kind of look like we do the same thing, and to a certain extent we do. But I think when we approach a problem, both in the Bright Ages and Oathbreakers, like it is really useful for us to ask different questions of the sources, and we really are. There were moments when David was like working on a chapter where he would just like read a source and be like, well, why is this happening like this? Why is this going like this? And Carolingian is like people who are immersed in the sources, like they get so wrapped up in kind of the way that questions have been asked and answered in the past. It takes like they get too close to it, and they can't have that kind of step back understanding about like just asking a different way. Like, well, maybe he didn't do that, and be like, oh yeah, no, maybe he didn't. That makes sense. So I think that was a fun part of the writing process as well for me.
Hmm. That makes a ton of sense to me, and it sort of resonates with like when I was still teaching. I found it so much easier to teach everything besides my subject, because with the stuff that you are learning along with your students, it's easier to point out like whatever the salient bits or the main points are, the main themes. But when you've been close to it for so long, it can get really, really hard to distill it down to, the most important bits. Are there other things that you feel like you bring to each other's work in terms of perspectives or, techniques, stuff like that?
Yeah, we have different tastes in whiskey, which is very productive because we share our taste in whiskey with each other, and then we find new things that we like. Um, I think that I'll just say something generally, and then David, I'll let you kind of answer. Is that I think David and I, we are huge proponents, and we think more humanists should work in partnership. Like co-writing, co-authorship, like we don't do that enough in history, English, like any of the kind of humanities discipline. This is a very common thing in STEM fields, even in like social science fields as well. Humanists need to do more of that. Because I think that, and that's not to say that you need to work with somebody all the time, but like if you find a partnership that works, even on specific projects, not necessarily on all your projects, like having somebody that can work as an editor with you, that can ask different questions, that can, kind of help you along the way, and you can help each other along the way. Like building that solidarity, that community, I think is just tremendously important and tremendously beneficial.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how exactly it happened this way. I mean, I know we have a story we tell, but it just we all do a lot of writing, and then you finish a draft, and then what happens next, right? You have to get to the end of the first draft. That is a story in and of itself. And at some point, someone has to write the first sentences down, right? And then a thing has to happen. Does it go to an editor? Does it go to a friend? Does it go to a beta reader? And when you have a collaborator, a lot of those processes happen with someone who you are working with and working intentionally kind of in this moment. So, I just wrote a little essay 2 days ago alone, and then I'm like, well, I have this draft now. Do I just send it to this editor? I wish I could just say, Matt, okay, your turn, and then we could send it to our editor together, and it's fine. A good editor worked out all right, but like, there's something really if you find a partnership that works, and not all partnerships work, then it becomes so much more. I hope it becomes so much more than the sum of its parts. It is not half the work. I'm not even sure it's 75% of the work. I think it is each of us still does the 100% of the work, except in this very first draft moment in which only one of you does that. But I think it's still just as much work. It's just more eyes and more thoughts and more knowledge bases and different assumptions. And aside from the fact that I like different whiskey, and also Matt is a Yankees fan, and I'm currently wearing a Red Sox sweatshirt. Other than that, we've really worked out pretty well.
Well, that's beautiful, and that attests to, I guess the healing nature of collaboration. Yeah. Thank you so much for joining us again. It was so exciting to talk to you about the Bright Ages a couple years ago, and to talk to you about this one. What's on the horizon for you both? What are you working on now?
I can't tell you.
Okay, that often happens. And
I have a project. My agent says I can't tell anyone, so I hope to have good news. And Matt and I are talking about a lot of future things for sure.
Nice.
Yeah, I think kind of longer term, I think David and we both have kind of projects that we're thinking about and working on. And then, but there may be a secret project that David and I are kind of working on, which again, we can't mention, but we'll stay tuned. Yeah.
That's great. Well, being able to like not mention something can be so much more exciting than even just mentioning it outright. So we've created mystery. This is wonderful. Thank you so much again. This has been really, it's always a delight to talk to you.
This was a lot of fun. Thank you for having us. Yeah.
Okay, listeners, please check out Oathbreakers, the War of Brothers that shattered an empire and made medieval Europe. It's absolutely, it's gripping, it's fascinating. It is it's a lovely work of history. So check it out at your favorite independent bookstore or library, wherever you like to go for those things. All right, it is time to close this chapter. Bye.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.